Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of different videos revolving around true crime cases, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already subscribed, then please do so. I will also have on the screen my second channel, my Instagram and my TikTok, where I am uploading pretty regularly different content on there. So if you want to see some more content from me, then check those out, but I'll also leave them in the description below. For today's video, I'm back discussing, it's a little bit more of a historical case because it did happen quite a while ago now. We're going to be discussing a serial killer case called the Cumminsville serial killer, who remains unidentified to this day. It's definitely a long one. Not only were there several murder victims of this unknown perpetrator, but there were also a number of attacks that were seemingly unsuccessful and believed to have been carried out by the same man. So I'm going to talk you through it, so get a cup of tea if you haven't already. This is going to be a long video. Before we get started, I just want to say a huge thank you to the sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. As you know, my channel is about all things education, and Skillshare is this online learning community with thousands of classes on countless topics. It's a community where creatives have the ability to come together and further their passion through classes on all topics. So these are photography, video skills, freelancing tips, music, illustration, everything really. That's just a few that I've listed off the top of my head. Since they are the sponsor of today's video, I wanted to just kind of let you guys know what class I've personally been loving recently on Skillshare. It's a video class called Confidence for Creatives, 5 Exercises to Grow Your Confidence and Self-Care by Eugena Washington. As I'm sure most of you know, I am self-employed fully and I do have a number of business streams, and so I'm always looking for these sort of tips on how I can maintain my productivity and boost my overall performance while also being very mindful of keeping a healthy balance and being able to look after myself to make sure that I'm not completely drowning in my workload. They have also just recently launched a brand new nail art class, which I thought would be perfect to mention just because of all of us adapting to life at home, the start of 2020 being in lockdown for the majority of us. So if you're looking to develop a new skill while you are at home, then this is the perfect time to do so and the perfect means of doing so. And in my opinion, the best thing about Skillshare is that everything fits into your schedule, and because most of the classes are under 60 minutes long, it means that they are easy to fit into your day-to-day schedule. They don't interfere with any of your work and you can fit one in really easily depending on what you're doing. I know a lot of you who watch my videos are really into your education and furthering your knowledge and building new skills every day, and this is just an amazing way to be able to build on your creativity, especially making the most of the time that we all have at the minute while being inside. Skillshare are also launching their brand new premium classes, meaning there aren't any ads during your online classes, and this costs you less than $10 or around £7 a month with an annual subscription. And obviously, with them being the sponsor of today's video, they're bringing a special offer to you guys. So the first 1,000 of my subscribers that click the link in the description will get a free trial of this Skillshare premium membership, so you can explore your creativity yourself and make the most of your time at home. To those of you who do make the most of this offer, I'd love to know which of these Skillshare classes you're actually enjoying at the minute and which of them you'd recommend, so feel free to send me a DM over on Instagram so I can check out some of your guys' recommendations. And thank you once again to Skillshare for being the sponsor of today's video. So with all that being said, we shall just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the Cumminsville serial killer. The Cumminsville murders that took place during the years of 1904 and 1910 have gone by many different names over the years, all of them referring to the murders of 5 women in South Cumminsville in Cincinnati. The murders all remain unsolved to this day, and the perpetrator is often referred to as many different names over the years, but most commonly they're referred to as the Cumminsville Ripper. The first attack had occurred on April the 30th in the year of 1904 on a 32-year-old woman named Mary McDonald. On that morning, Mary had left her home on East 7th Street, where she lived with a 24-year-old woman named Mrs. Finley. It wasn't known exactly where she was heading that morning, but a number of eyewitnesses had seen her in the area of Chester Park. From here, it was believed that she visited her friends, who were known as the Stagmans, in their home on Knowlton's Corner. According to John Stagman, he had driven Mary to the centre of the city at around 11 PM that evening, specifically leaving her on College Hill on Main Street as per her request. But this had been the last known sighting of Mary McDonald alive. In the early hours of the following morning, an engineer employed by the Big Four Railway Company had been working on the railway nearby when he'd come across Mary close to death. She'd been rushed to the hospital nearby, but sadly she ended up passing away as a result of her injuries. When her body was examined, it was discovered that she had a rather large bruise mark on the back of her head. But the most obvious injury that Mary had sustained had been that her left leg below her knee had been completely severed off. Authorities determined that she had no belongings on her, things that she should have been carrying, and came to the conclusion that she was likely robbed during the attack. One of the first theories that was explored by authorities had been that she was attacked by someone while the pair were both travelling on a tram, one of many that were located all throughout the city, and then the perpetrator had thrown her off of the moving vehicle, hence the location in which she was found. But soon other theories began to be explored, with another one being that Mary herself had been intoxicated and fallen onto a railway line and injured herself, where she was then injured by an oncoming train. But before any further developments could be made in the case of Mary MacDonald's death, the second attack occurred on October the 2nd of 1904. This victim had been Louise Mueller, who had last been seen by eyewitnesses at a public rally in South Cumminsville. She'd been spotted stood in a crowd during a public speech at the socialist rally, and this was located not far from where she lived. Later on in the day, a passerby had stumbled across her remains lying in the weeds in an area that was commonly known to the locals as Lover's Lane. Once the authorities had been able to name the victim, they very quickly began to receive reports that Louise had a number of male love interests in her life at the time of her death. It was discovered that she had made plans to meet one man in particular, named as Frank Eastman, once she'd finished at the rally that day, and this had been the authorities' first avenue for them to investigate. Louise's body was examined by medical professionals who determined that she had suffered a fractured skull, as well as having 2 large gash-like wounds on her face. Similarly to the death of Mary MacDonald, authorities had considered the possibility of Louise having been struck by a train, since the location of her remains had not been far from the railway tracks. Following up on each of the leads regarding to Louise's lovers, it became clear to authorities that she was on good terms with virtually all of them, and no one appeared to bear any ill will towards her. And then, on October the 3rd of 1904, the third victim was discovered. The remains were found lying on a piece of vacant ground located next to the Spring Grove Cemetery in South Cumminsville. This victim was soon identified as being 18-year-old Alma Steinewig. I do apologise if I mispronounced that. She had been a popular young girl who was particularly known by the members of her local church. This young woman had been last known to be at her place of work as a telephone operator on the day before her body was discovered. After leaving work, it was reported that she had been seen boarding a tram not far from her workplace in the company of an unidentified man. As it would turn out, the witness who had provided this sighting had stated that he often saw Alma boarding the same tram at the same time on her way home from work, but never in the company of this man. The examination of Alma's remains showed that she had been brutally attacked with something large and blunt, possibly a club. Because of this attack, she was missing teeth and she had experienced significant blood loss, and this blunt force trauma had likely been her cause of death. There had been a blood trail discovered by the authorities which led them to believe that she had been attacked elsewhere and then dragged to the vacant lot where she was found. And as it would later turn out, authorities would discover that Alma's tram transfer ticket had still been inside her hand when her remains were discovered. And this finding provided a vital element in the timeline of her whereabouts prior to her death. It suggested that she hadn't made her transfer tram after exiting the train she was last seen on by that eyewitness. During the investigation, Alma's boyfriend had told the authorities that the day before her remains were discovered, he had made a phone call to her while she was at work, asking her if she wanted to go out with him that very same evening. Alma had allegedly told him that she had been out dancing earlier that day and that she wanted to go straight home from work, get a good night's sleep and rest before having to work again. Aside from this information, the only other details that could be collected by the authorities had been boot print marks that were found in the ground of the vacant lot around where her remains were found. But because of the time in which this case had occurred, there was very little they could do with this information. The fourth victim had not occurred until the year of 1910, although there were a number of assaults that had occurred in the years between, were believed to have likely been unsuccessful attempts of the very same attacker. In 1904 specifically, there had been a number of attacks reported by women who had provided descriptions of their attack to the authorities. A woman named Miss Clousing had been heading to a party when she walked over a bridge located near Elmore Street in South Cumminsville. It was here that a man had jumped out at her from the shadows and grabbed her bag that she was carrying. She was then hit over the head with a hatchet and she fell to the floor, where she then landed on the railway tracks. The attacker had then run away from the scene and Miss Clausing was left in the spot that she was injured until a group of men passing by happened to spot her on the ground. They carried her to a nearby building where 2 local doctors were called to attend to her wounds. She was later carried to hospital after the initial examination by these doctors, and after 2 weeks of treatment she had recovered. Initially her family had asked doctors to not alert the authorities of the incident. That was until news spread of Alma Steinerweg's murder, when they realised that there may have been a link between these attacks. Another attempted attack occurred on November the 6th of 1904, this time on Mrs. Wynne's. Her husband had left her in their home alone one evening for him to make the short trip to the local pharmacy for some medicine, when she then heard a loud knock on her front door. And this had been at around 11 p.m, and when she'd opened the door she'd found a man that she later described as being short and thickly built. The man had spoken to her, specifically asking her for food, but she had ultimately refused his request just because the whole scenario seemed rather strange to her. And after she refused, he appeared to walk away from the home, but unaware to Mrs. Wynne's, he had simply snuck around the back of the house and hid by the back door. Not long after this strange encounter, Mrs. Wynne's had then left to go into the back garden when the man had grabbed her. She struggled to get herself out of his grip and managed to let out a short, loud scream in the process. At just about the same time, her husband had been arriving back home after deciding partway through his walk that he wasn't going to go to the pharmacy, he'd just do it another time. He'd been just close enough to the home to be able to hear his wife's piercing scream, and he ran through the house to find his wife. But the attacker had heard the man running through the home in their direction, and he'd immediately fled the property, and while Mr. Wynne's had attempted to chase him with his shotgun that he'd grabbed, the attacker managed to escape. The following attempted attack had been on Dorothy Hannaford, as she was returning home from a meeting at the Young Women's Christian Association. She'd been waiting for the tram to arrive that she would usually take on her route home, and this had been very near to where Alma Steinerweg would be attacked that very same night. A man who she described as being short and rough looking had jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her arm. She'd started screaming, and it seemed as though the assailant was about to be successful in dragging her in the direction of the railway tracks when the trolley car that she was waiting for had begun to pull up towards the stop. When the pair had spotted it approaching, the attacker fled. Dorothy did experience a feeling of great shock following the ordeal, but ultimately she managed to escape the incident unharmed. The next reported attack occurred just an hour after this attack on Dorothy Hannaford. Mrs. Unkerbach and Mrs. Hagedorn were neighbours of the Hannaford family, and they too were attacked by an unknown man in this area. He'd surprised them and grabbed one of them by their arms. The other managed to escape his grip and hit him in the mouth, which then obviously startled him and kind of knocked him back. And the pair managed to use this moment of shock to free themselves, and they both began beating him before he ran off. The day after the murder of Alma Steinerweg, two young women referred to as the Weimer sisters and their friend Marnie Roddy had been passing by the Spring Grove Cemetery when a man launched himself at the girls and started beating them. But despite having one of them pinned to the floor, the girls were able to use the fact that he was outnumbered to their advantage, and they began attacking him. They later recalled that they remembered tugging at his hair and trying to scratch his eyes, and ultimately he fled through the cemetery, leaving the girls unharmed. Another attack had happened in the same area of the Spring Grove Cemetery. Mrs. Virgil was with her mother and a Mrs. Kelly walking through the wooded area located just behind the Spring Grove Cemetery in the evening time. An unknown man had jumped out at them from the shadow, but he didn't manage to attack any of them. Each of these women had reacted quickly enough and screamed loudly before running through the neighbouring cornfield in the direction of the street. In November of 1904, a woman named Mrs. Gerbig was also attacked in the same area of the murder of Alma Steinerweg, not once but twice. She managed to escape her attacker both times and run to safety. In the same month, Josephine Hewitt had been walking home at night past the Spring Grove Cemetery when a rough-looking man had jumped out at her from the grounds. According to her, he had gone straight for her throat, but she had hit him in the eye before he'd managed to injure her any further, and she pulled out a revolver that she had equipped herself with. After hearing news of the recent attack, she decided to prepare herself in case she was ever in the unfortunate situation that these other women had been in. Once the attacker had seen the gun, he started to run in the other direction, and she proceeded to shoot in the direction that he was running in until the chamber was empty. She decided she didn't want to stick around and see if she was successful in shooting the attacker, and so she ran home and alerted the authorities. The police then set out to investigate the attack, but they found no sign of the man. After this series of seemingly unsuccessful attempts, it appeared to the authorities that the attacker had stopped his attempts for quite some time. That was until 1910 when the fourth murder victim was found. On New Year's Eve of 1909, a 36-year-old woman named Anna Lloyd had been let out of work early in order for them all to go and celebrate. She worked as a secretary at the Wilbur Hanna Lumber Company, and a sighting of her was placed at being 20 minutes after leaving her workplace. She She was seen at a tram stop in the area of the Spring Grove Cemetery, but it appeared to authorities that she'd never made it onto the tram. The following day, a passerby had come across a woman's body near the nearby railway tracks. When the authorities were called to investigate, they discovered that she had been gagged and brutally beaten and that her throat had been cut. They theorised that she had been attacked while waiting for the tram and then dragged away from the street, but she'd managed to put up a fight. As a result of her attempt to fight back, the assailant had ended up killing her with some kind of bladed weapon. When a search of the nearby area was conducted, authorities discovered her bag left around a mile away from where her remains were found. There had been no money in the bag, leading them to suspect that she had been robbed at some point during the attack. And following this attack, it seemed as though the public panic started to grow as people started to realise that all of these attacks could be connected. People had started pointing fingers at the locals that they feared to be the unknown attacker, and it seemed as though because of this, the authorities had really started to dedicate their time in finding the unknown man. In October of 1910, the 5th victim of the serial killer had been discovered. The remains were found in a boarding house in South Cumminsville and were identified as being 26-year-old Mary Hackney. She'd been living in the boarding house with her husband, and he and another guest had been the ones to discover her remains inside the house. Authorities discovered that she had been attacked using an axe, and they found her throat had been cut and multiple gashes all over her body and face. But this attack had appeared to authorities as being different to the previous, when they soon realised that the house hadn't been robbed. Not only this, but this time the attacker had left behind the murder weapon. An axe covered in blood had been left at the scene of the attack, as well as them finding a bloody thumbprint on one of the door frames. The authorities at the time had decided that the next step was to drain the nearby canal in an attempt to uncover any other potentially discarded belongings of the attacker, but they didn't find anything in doing so. And after this point, it was believed that the serial attacker had not attacked again. From the perspective of the authorities, they had very little to go on in terms of their search for the identity of this unknown man, although the majority of the victims had managed to provide relatively similar or matching descriptions of the assailant, making it easier for them to sort of connect the incidents as being carried out by the same person. The descriptions led them to believe they were searching for a short, heavy-built man who wore a dark hat. However, they did have trouble determining the ethnicity of the man, since a lot of the victims had provided differing descriptions, likely because of the environment in which they were attacked in, so a lot of them happened late at night in darkness. At one point, it's believed that the local police department had received a letter from someone who signed only as SDM. In the letter, the author claimed to have witnessed Anna Lloyd's murder and is able to identify her killer, but this letter was later determined to be a hoax. There were a number of suspects considered in the investigation, some of which were ruled out relatively quickly. Harley Hackney, who had been the husband of Mary Hackney, the final murder victim, was arrested alongside Charles Eckhart, who had been the young boarder who had discovered the remains in the company of Harley Hackney. The pair were arrested on suspicion of being involved in the murder of Mary Hackney, and also arrested with them was a man named Herman Schwering. I apologise if I mispronounced that. He had been driving a milk delivery car at the time of the murder in the area. They were all questioned and ultimately cleared of being to blame for Mary Hackney's murder. Another suspect considered by the authorities was a 34-year-old man named Henry Cook. He was considered the prime suspect in the murder of Anna Lloyd specifically, as two 14-year-old girls had claimed to have seen two men leaving the scene of the murder on the date that it had occurred. And one of the young girls had positively identified him as being one of the pair that she'd seen leaving the area, and as a result he was arrested. There's not a lot of information regarding Cook's release, but it's believed that the authorities likely had to release him because they just didn't have a lot of evidence to link him to it. The next suspect was a 21-year-old George Lewis, a man from Cleveland who was working as a marine fireman. He was arrested in Ohio, and when questioned on his whereabouts during the time of Anna Lloyd's murder, he had allegedly been concerningly vague in his response. As a result, he was arrested by the authorities, but was later released when they received word that he had been in prison in Hamilton at the time of the murder. Another had been 21-year-old James Fields, who had been the only black male to be arrested in connection to the crimes. Like Cook's release, there was not a lot of information regarding why they did so, but it is believed that the authorities had realised the majority of the attack victims had described their attacker as being a white male, and this ultimately cleared him of suspicion. There were also a number of other crimes that occurred around the same time that were considered as being potentially carried out by the same perpetrator. Just a few days after the murder of Anna Lloyd, an unidentified black male described as acting crazed was found on the doorstep of a man's home in Kentucky wielding a blood-covered knife and screaming. He'd allegedly screamed aloud that he had killed Anna Lloyd and was believed to have been running off in the direction of Richmond. The owner of the house had been scared after witnessing this, and he ultimately called his local authorities, who then in turn sent out a group of officers in search of this man, but it's not known whether or not they were successful in locating the man. The Dayton Strangler being connected was a popular theory at the time, and authorities had attempted to determine a link between Anna Lloyd's death specifically and the murders occurring at the same time in Dayton. And the Dayton Strangler has yet to be identified, leaving many to believe that they were in fact the same person, but again, this was never confirmed. At some point following the murder of Mary Hackney, it was announced that the authorities had arrested a man named Richard Finley, who was being held pending investigation. And little else is known about this part of the investigation, but it was believed that he too was released due to a lack of evidence connecting him to the crime. Over the years, the case has been discussed many times, and a lot of people draw different conclusions, with some people believing that the authorities had no luck whatsoever in finding the perpetrator, and others believing that they likely did have the perpetrator in custody at some point, they just didn't look closely enough into him. There's a lot, but unfortunately because of how long ago these occurred, it is very unlikely that we will find out who the Cumminsville Ripper was. But let me know your guys' thoughts down below, whether you think there was a perpetrator that you think could have been the one to blame, or whether or not these were even connected. A lot of people still pick apart that these were even connected, but it does seem to be a widely believed fact that these were all carried out by the same perpetrator. And don't forget to check out the Skillshare link in my description. Like I said, the first 1,000 of my subscribers that click the link gets a free trial to the premium membership. Thank you to Skillshare for being the sponsor of today's video, and thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.